5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Welcome to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Co-pilot Pearson and I are on our summer break, but to help keep you sane, dear citizens of Planet Normal, while we're away, we're bringing you some of our biggest interviews from our recent archive, the discussions we've had on Planet Normal, the rocket of right thinking, the flying refuge of reasoned views. Now in April, I interviewed the author and campaigner Tony Sewell. A returned traveller on the rocket of right thinking, Dr. Sewell chaired the committee which produced the highly influential 2021 report of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. He joins us again to discuss his new book, Black Success. As a Londoner proud of his Jamaican heritage, Dr. Sewell and his fellow commissioners, almost all of them from ethnic minority backgrounds, received a great deal of criticism for producing conclusions which pushed back against the narrative that the UK is institutionally racist. While determined to highlight and act against genuine racism, Tony Sewell believes strongly that many of the positive aspects of being black in modern Britain are lost and race relations are further damaged due to an overemphasis on stories of victimisation. Tony Sewell, welcome back to Planet Normal. Great to have you returning to the programme.
Great to be here.
You really shot to public prominence, I think, when you were part of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. You were the chair of that commission. Your commissioners came up with a report that said, while racism still exists, Britain as a whole is not a racist country. Just remind us of how that report was initially received.
I think what happened was that it was happening with prior to the report, really, but there were lobby groups and activist groups that looked at the personnel that were on the committee and the commission and myself. And of course, they just wanted us to say something that, without any kind of rigor or investigation, that just condemned every single facet of the society as institutionally racist. And that was it. But we decided not to do that. We decided just to simply be honest and open and follow the numbers and the data and come up with the conclusions that, that route took us. And I think what really happened there was you had the outcome of activist groups really beginning to try and control the narrative and the agenda. But worse still, they captured the media and people felt they had to come in and support it. The other thing was a large chunk of our liberal society seemed to be drunk on the George Floyd kind of outcome, taking that elixir and then kind of feeling that in some kind of guilt run, they had to sort of support anything that was, seemingly kind of anti-racist. And so, in a sense, on top of that, we'd just come out of COVID, or we were just emerging from that. So it was that mixture, perfect storm or unperfect storm, that we faced.
It's almost 2 years ago that your commission reported, Tony, and in those 2 years, you've written a new book in your own right, Black Success, The Surprising Truth. The strength of language in your personal book, Tony, seems even stronger than in the report on race and ethnic disparities. What do you think's happened with race relations in the UK over the last 2 years since your report?
Well, I think what's happened is that really the problem that they've got is that, and this is where my book and the report kind of a bit different, in the sense that I gave it over to the government and really championed by Kemi Badenoch. What she's done is extended the recommendations. You got to remember, the report wasn't just analysis. It had lots and lots of recommendations based on analysis that really there were structural issues. So we weren't running away from that. What I think has happened since is that those recommendations have been all implemented. One of the ones that I kind of think is very significant is the Office for Health Disparity. News stories move on, things like that. So I don't think people are obsessed with the report anymore, but we still have the kind of politics of identity. We still have a whole kind of seizure. The church is another example of people still feeling that the issue to do with race isn't as complex as we brought out in the report. They're not really thinking through the difference between disparity and discrimination. And that's the key problem that we've got to unravel here. There's a difference between the two things.
Indeed. Take us back to the 70s and 80s. You grew up in South London. You were from a proud Jamaican background. The church was very important to you, as was reggae music very, very important to you. And then the Brixton riots happened in the early 80s and really exploded into your consciousness. How is the Britain, the South London of 1981 that provoked those riots different to South London today?
Well, let me just tell you one thing on the black demographic that's different. It's no longer Caribbean. It is essentially a West African space now, in a sense, or a Nigerian space. So if you go to any primary school now in London, or that has a lot of black children in there, the majority of them will be of a Nigerian background. Now that's significant in the sense that what we faced from the Caribbean context was different than I think what young people are facing now. And particularly, we were facing very open racism, but it was in that whole thing that everybody seemed to be excluded, but black kids were excluded almost 10 times more. And then, of course, the issue with the police, the open racism of the police that exploded into those riots was significant. And so I grew up in that context. However, what was not being told, and that's where really the book is quite interesting, is that there was a significant amount of what I call agency and self-affirmation inside the suffering. People ask me what it was like in the 70s. I said, I had a fantastic time. On the other hand, we also faced a lot of racism. So it's a dual thing that we faced.
You say in your book, you say in the book, Tony, if I may, on a family show, we did get shat on, but we were smart enough to use it as fertilizer for the imagination.
I mean, that's the Jamaican way, in a sense, or the Caribbean way. Let's get clear. Let's make this wider here. And I think that's ability to reinvent yourself. Let me give you an example of how that works itself in the housing context, where, for example, the slogans, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, that kind of open racism. So what that did, that forced that community to go and get their own houses themselves. And so what you then ended up with was a community of homeowners. And it's the biggest one even to date. And so we were almost accumulating capital via the suffering. So we always had this kind of complex relationship with, I think, oppression in inverted commas. And I think that's what the book wants to try and do. It's not justifying it, but it's saying that, look, the situation, once we engage anything and we use our agency and our self-affirmation, we come out with something completely different. And it's a positive outcome. And that story hasn't been told. So the Windrush gets kind of hijacked by the scandal in a way. And we don't really learn of the stories of resilience and of great things that generation had accomplished. What you've got to understand, Liam, is that nobody in this, there's almost a vested interest in not going down the positive experience of black people in Britain. Nobody wants to talk about that. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that that community suffered, but yet did well. It's a kind of dualism that's there, but it's a reality. And I think that because, you see, if you lean on the side of anything to do with a positive outcome, the claim is either you're denying racism or you're colluding with it, or you're somehow, in some kind of, delusion. And I think that's the problem that we face. And so what's exciting about the new generation, the Nigerians coming, is they haven't got that baggage at all. They've come straight in. And here's the irony. I don't know if you know you're London, but the Nigerian community have set stall in areas that in the Caribbean community we wouldn't think of. For example, Thamesmead, all these areas have gone in and have just seen house prices, and they set up stall and they're doing extremely well, particularly in education. And that shows you again that you almost dragnet, if you like, of a racist discourse that constantly will say racial discourse on this, because sometimes what happens is it doesn't allow you then to see another way through, that the society has changed and has been more open, and you've got to almost be flexible with that. Otherwise, you're just in a corner, misery and moaning, and really almost going backwards. Another
difference with your commission report of 2022, Tony, if I may say so, and your new book, Black Success, is that in your book, you don't have to use official committee speak. You can really use your own voice. And you really point the finger here. You say, it's clear to me that emerging alongside a genuine struggle for racial justice were race hustlers, your phrase. They needed and still need a narrative of victimhood in order to keep their jobs, receive grants, stay relevant. Sadly, this hasn't changed. There are new books and films released seemingly weekly that revel in black misery. A lot of people are going to criticize you for that.
One of the things that my area is in the literatures, in the arts area, and I haven't come across anything of irony, the satire, the whole ability to look at yourself and poke at authority figures. They're just bland and they're very kind of glum. And it's because they're captured, in a sense, by, if you like, the theatre space, which should have been a real kind of place of sending things up. And, that's just not there. And the music is similar.
The idea that teachers need lessons in unconscious bias training, or that black students need sessions on how Egypt was a black kingdom, are nothing but big diversions. Tell it like you see it, Tony. Some people will criticize you openly. Other people will be punching the air silently, glad that you're saying
well,
this.
The thing is, the reality is all based on evidence. And that mistake was because we worked in Hackney and we tried everything to get that whole set of young black men to a point where, or black boys really, to a point of achievement. All those interventions didn't work. What did work, to be honest, was when we fired the very poor head teachers. And we brought in people with high aspirations. We brought in people with great visions like Sir Michael Wiltshire. That instigated the whole academy movement. And the results, Hackney went from being one of the worst education districts in the country to being one of the best. So it's quite clear to me that a lot of the identity stuff was a diversion, yeah, for sure.
You have been really critical of the whole sort of diversity, inclusivity agenda. Is there nothing positive in the sort of new attempt that there's been in recent years to promote equality and diversity? Or do you see most of it as counterproductive, Tony?
I think a lot of that diversity inclusion stuff, there's a lot of it that's very useful and very and needed. For example, challenges in terms of employment, the employment space, and people thinking about who's in the workplace and the reality of discrimination that is happening. We can see in the police, we can see in different areas. I'd be a fool to turn around and say to you today that racism does not exist in Britain and that we need to challenge the structures there to change it. What I'm saying in the book, though, is that what we haven't done is unleash the power of that community, of those people themselves. One of the things in education that we didn't do enough of was we didn't teach the children how to use their own agency, how to almost manage their own teachers, how to actually manage themselves. And in a sense, you see now we've got big mental health problems with young people because we haven't given them the resilience. Instead, what we've done, we saw differences in outcomes. We went and signed up with unconscious bias training for alleged white racist teachers. That took us just a completely wrong route. We were blaming the victim. That was where I'm talking about how we got unstuck.
You sit as a Tory peer, Tony. How do you think your party has managed these inclusivity issues? In general, do you think the government could have done more in this area? Because it is an area now of some public concern.
Of course, every government will have this problem. And I do think that this government needs to do more. I think it's trying. I do think it still needs to work on these issues. I look across now and I see a government that has somebody from a Hindu Indian background, and the country is pretty indifferent to that. I think that shows how much we've progressed. I mean, if you and I were to say today that if you were to look across that Tory cabinet or that Tory kind of governance and say that 30 years ago it would look like that, you would say, no way.
Kemi Badenoch has just brought out a new report on equality and diversity. And in introducing that report, she, like you, used strong language. No group should be worse off because of companies' diversity policies, whether they be black women or white men. Performative gestures such as compulsory pronouns and rainbow lanyards are often a sign that organisations are struggling to demonstrate how they are being inclusive. As you say, Tony, and you say with authority, given your life's experience, race relations have significantly improved in this country in recent years. But aren't they now in serious danger of being set back by this inclusivity agenda?
I think what's happened is that what we didn't do, it's the case of the whole idea that maybe what we didn't do, and that's why the report, we go back to the report bit rather than my book, is that the report really did land this in a more complex area of what we call disparity and look at the complexity of disparity. So, for example, the life of somebody who is a Pakistani background taxi driver in Bradford, living in Bradford, is completely different than a Hindu Indian doctor living in Harrow. Yet the categories, or the race categories, put all brown people together and call it BAME. These kind of, and then of course the differences between the Caribbean outcome in schools and the Nigerian outcome. So what we needed to do in looking at almost social mobility, social cohesion and disparity, we needed to just go at it with race, not necessarily at the forefront. We needed to look at a whole kind of system of ways in which people and the outcomes that make you different are not necessarily race-based. And then where does discrimination really operate then? You see, it probably does operate maybe in the workplace, maybe names, for example, CV names or things like that. Where does it really matter? And does it really matter then in other areas? Is there other factors that are driving it? So, for example, one of the things that I was really concerned about was that we were not looking at the family and looking at those kinds of issues. We were then diverted to keep looking at these identity racial things instead of really getting down to the core issues.
That, for me, Tony, was the real unifying factor between your report a couple of years ago and your new book, and indeed the new report that Kemi Badenoch's department recently brought out, that in your conclusion, ethnic minority success is evident in many, many places, and where it isn't evident, that's more down to class than race, with family being a massive overall driver as well.
But you know what? Let me just tell you this, and this is quite interesting, that it's not even left and right here, because even the Mail know that it gets more clickbait if it runs a race story than it does another story. So everybody seems to be indulged in the race element. I find it really strange that sometimes you get somebody being interviewed, a black person being interviewed on TV or newspaper, and they have to almost say that they had some experience of overcoming a white phenomenon to get to their success, instead of just saying it was my energy or my family or whatever. We're obsessed with this thing, and it's taking us down routes that just are not right and just are not correct. And I just think that what we've got to do is kind of almost, and that's why I like what Kemi's doing in a way, is saying that we're going to look at this in a more complex area. I sense there is a change. I sense that people are getting exhausted with this same narrative and are prepared now to listen to something that's much more nuanced.
Lord Tony Sewell, author of Black Success, newly published by Forum. Thanks a lot for appearing on Planet Normal.
Thank you.
Back in March, both Alison and I interviewed the author and filmmaker Martin Durkin. Durkin's latest film, Climate the Movie, The Cold Truth, takes issue with what he calls climate alarmism, a trend which, in this deeply researched film, available for free on YouTube, Durkin says does not reflect scientific reality. Climate the Movie includes contributions from Nobel Prize winners, professors from MIT and Princeton, and former US presidential advisors, all of them prominent scientists, who insist that, quotes, climate alarm has become an industry of its own, with the burden of the related net zero transition often falling heaviest on the shoulders of those on lower incomes who can afford it least. Why did you feel you had to make it?
Well, because everyone's talking such a load of bollocks about climate and have been for so long. It's deeply frustrating if you think that it's all nonsense, the climate thing, because, if you're in polite society and you suggest that, A, you're considered a total demon for even suggesting that it's not true. And B, you always get this comeback of, but the consensus, all the scientists say, everyone agrees, And so I wanted to make a film really that looked into the nature of the consensus as well as the science.
Can you just tell us a bit about the pressures that you found that scientists are under to support what increasingly looks like something that isn't based on the data?
The frustrating thing for scientists, I mean, good, honest scientists in this area, is that you're not really allowed even to point to mainstream scientific data or observations. I mean, published in mainstream journals, carried out by scientists from very respected universities and so on, even cited by the IPCC and all this sort of thing. You're simply not allowed to talk about the stuff that doesn't fit into the climate alarm narrative. And the pressure on them to shut up is extreme. And I think it sort of comes from two sources. One is a rather shallow financial one. This involves so much money, the climate industry now, on the academic side and elsewhere, that you're really deemed to be rocking the boat if you say that you don't think this is a problem. There are loads of university departments that rely on money that's got the climate tag on it. There are a lot of individual scientists whose whole careers are built on this and whose funding depends on this. So you're actually threatening the livelihoods of a lot of people if you dare to challenge this. But in a broader way, it's also become, very much a political thing. If you're an academic, if you're, one of the middle class intelligentsia, broadly speaking, in the media, in the public sector in some way, in the third sector, that general worldview is pro-government, and being pro-government has become synonymous with buying into the climate crisis. And so if you say, you think it's not true, then, oh my God, you must vote Trump, or, you must vote Brexit, or you're labeled, you must like Nigel Farage. You're suddenly in that sort of demon camp. And so there are these pressures, and there's more institutional pressures too. I mean, you're not likely to get funding if you go against the climate alarm because so much funding is connected to this. You're likely not to get published. So there's a kind of huge deluge of crap sort of comes on your head if you dare to poke your head above the parapet here. I mean, we've got scientists in the film, as you know, who talk about it, in effect being career suicide if you're a university scientist and you come out strongly against this.
Alison and I have both seen preview versions of the film, Martin, of course. Listeners won't have seen the film. It's literally just coming out now. Just tell us briefly the nature of the people who appear in the film and what they say that's so very different from what Planet Normal listeners will have heard on their televisions and radios many, many times over recent years.
Well, we've tried to keep it to very respected and highly qualified scientists talking about the science, because that's the usual comeback. Oh, who says this? And so, for example, we've got Professor Stephen Coonan, who was science advisor to President Obama, and he was both provost and vice president of Caltech, which is one of the most respected research institutes in the world. And he said, look, I'm just going to use the official data, the official observations to show that this just doesn't stack up. And the idea that this is A, that this is settled at all, but B, that is settled in the direction of there being a climate crisis is nonsense. There is no climate crisis. Even their data, there has not been an increase in hurricane activity. There's not been an increase in droughts. There's not an increase in wildfires. It's just, all of this is just not true. And you can see just by looking at the data. And listeners can, by the way. I mean, I'd recommend, there are some great sites. There's one called No Tricks Zone. Tricks as in car tricks. And there's stacks and stacks of science papers on there that disagree with the climate crisis, often written by people who don't themselves disagree. Nevertheless, the data disagrees with the climate crisis thing. We've got Professor Will Happer. He's been science advisor to 3 presidents or 4, can't remember. And he was professor of physics. Now it's Princeton. Can't remember what it was before, but he's one of the great physicists of his generation. We've got John Clauser, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022. We've got Professor Nir Shaviv, who is a brilliant physicist, young physicist from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who had been at Caltech before then, and they're dying to make Dean of Science over there. I mean, he's a enormously bright guy. We've got Professor Henrik Svensmark, who is a great physicist from Denmark. And we've got Roy Spencer, who's one of the biggest names, one of the guys who invented the weather satellite system, works at and with NASA to develop that, which results from pretty much the satellite observations are directly at odds with most of the nonsense that's talked about climate. I mean, I could go on, but the list is terribly impressive. And there are all sorts of impressive people we weren't able to get in but are, very sound people. They're not flat earthers. That's the thing. If you hear Al Gore, you'll say, oh, these guys are just flat earthers. These people are enormously respected scientists. And the thing that gets me, if you watch any of these ghastly BBC programs about climate, they don't back anything up. There'll be this bland assertion, oh, yeah, we're changing the climate. Oh, we're changing the earth, all this sort of. Where's the science to back this up? Where is the science to support these contentions? It's not difficult. Viewers can do it. Get on the internet, read up what Earth's temperature is today compared to the last 500 million years. Look up where CO2 levels are compared to the last 500 million years. Don't take my word for it. Don't take the word of all the wonderful academics I have in my film. Go read for yourself.
I absolutely loved Professor Will Happer, Martin, and the way he speaks. He could walk straight out of a John Updike or indeed a John Cheever short story. And he said, there's this mischievous idea that scientific truth is determined by consensus. And I suppose that brought me on to thinking about how we pride ourselves on living in a rational age. And yet we seem to be prone, as for millennia, really, or certainly through the centuries, to these spasms of madness. And we could point in recent times, of course, to the COVID madness in which something called the science was used to bludgeon everybody into obedience. Having steeped yourself in this, where did this particular madness arise? And has it been kept going because it is a kind of a great money spinner?
I think it's not a sporadic madness. I think it's a systematic madness. And I think there is luckily, because of COVID, there's a much greater cynicism developing about what experts say. I think there was, and the same is true of Brexit as well, all the experts lined up and said, well, if you vote for Brexit, the next day the economy will collapse. And the experts say that, and they challenge Gove. Who are you to challenge the experts? Likewise, in COVID, the experts came out with all sorts of codswallop, which turned out not to be true. And so I think that there is happily a growing cynicism about what so-called experts say. And the difficulty is that the experts that we're talking about are part of the publicly funded establishment. There is a class of experts whose interests lie with there being a big government whose livelihoods depend on government spending and on whose jobs are defined and justified by government regulation. So they have a specific class interest. They believe in big government because their livelihoods depend on it, and that's how they view the world, and that's what they tend to promote. And so, for example, Liam knows with economics the number of experts who will say, "Oh yeah, it's fine printing money. It's great. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay." Or they say, large amounts of debt. That's fine. We can cope with it. It's not a problem. Huge taxation. That's fine. The government will spend money, your money for you, and it will generate growth. All sorts of nonsense is kind of spouted by so-called experts who are in fact really just reflecting their own particular class interests. And so I think that doing this has really solidified in my mind the view that, this is, not to put too fine a point on it, we're kind of engaged in a class war, I think. And one half of that class war is the publicly funded establishment and their fellow travellers.
Tell us how you think that debate on climate change is shifting, Martin. The Tory government pushed back the date at which it's illegal to make cars with internal combustion engines from 2030 to 2035 to where it was the EU average. You're getting a sense now that there's a bit of realism coming into the debate about climate change. Why do you think that's happening?
Well, I think they're coming to the limits of what's possible, because if there are blackouts and if the economy collapses, then really they can't. That's a brick wall for them. So they've got to rein back a little bit to stop that happening. But I can't see very much that there's a shift in the kind of ideology. I think we imagine that we live in a democracy, but every political party buys into the green agenda. If you think that it's all codswallop and that the whole renewables malarkey is just going to wreck manufacturing and so on and so forth, and you don't agree that there should be low traffic neighborhoods and whatever, who are you going to vote for? The Tories buy into it, Labour buys into it, everyone buys into it. There is a sense in which no matter what And it's a bit the same with economics. If you think that the state, should, taxation should be 10% flat rate, the state should spend an awful lot less, the state should be a lot less big. Who'd you vote for? This is a stitch-up. There is no offer on the ballot paper that says we're just going to scrap the green agenda. So although they're reining back a little bit and saying, we'll delay, they still say we're going for net zero. This nonsense phrase, as if we could survive with, not producing any carbon dioxide. I'm not sure there's a shift in the debate there. I think there's a shift in the debate among ordinary people. I think there's a much, much greater degree of cynicism there. But how that's going to manifest itself, I don't know, because you see the emergence of alternative political movements, reform or other things in other countries, support for Trump. An awful lot of people who support Trump don't particularly like Trump, but they really hate the people who hate Trump. And they regard that as an anti-establishment gesture. And I think that that's going to start happening in other countries too.
We have had a sort of warning signal this week. Germany is clearly not going to hit its electric vehicles target. So in answer to your question, I think that realism is going to give them a bloody nose. In the end, if they can't make money out of some of these things, then it's going to really hit them. But coming back, Martin, to that very interesting point you made about class, one of the things that comes out from Climate the movie is what I would describe as a Puritan finger-wagging hair shirt element, particularly from these middle-class protesters. You vulgar people are enjoying yourself a bit much with your cheap foreign holidays and your white vans. Do you think there's an element of snobbery, almost, in fact, misanthropy, which underpins the climate debate?
I think there's a really strong element of that. I've read, because I've done films before on the environmental movement, I've read lots and lots of environmental stuff. And the thing that finally the penny dropped a few years back, that you could be both anti-capitalist and anti-working class. And in fact, that's what we're seeing. Because how come Prince Charles is anti-capitalist? He buys into the green thing. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the IMF, they all buy into this thing. We strangely have an anti-capitalist establishment. Yeah, the establishment loves taxation because it feeds off it. It loves regulation because, that's its little empire. So oddly enough, this myth that in a capitalist society, the establishment must be capitalist and pro-capitalist, not true. We have an anti-capitalist establishment, and also anti-capitalist politics are quite posh. Back in, I put on a funny accent now, but actually I come from the Northeast. I was Geordie. And when I've had a bit of drink, I started talking Geordie again. But back in the North, the kind of working class side of my extended family were the ones who voted Brexit, the ones that voted UKIP, or the ones that actually are quite pro-capitalist. It's the posh element who went to university that are quite left-wing. There is green anti-capitalism is terribly snobby. If you read their thing, they say the world is consuming too much, and they loathe mass production and mass consumption. Oh my God, we're all consuming far. They don't mean they're consuming too much. And the form of consumption they hate, they hate the IKEA, they hate McDonald's, they hate all, Walmart. What they don't hate is, the really posh cheese shops in Highbury and posh vintners and the places where they get the Persian rugs from and the place where they get the nice Italian floor tiles and things like that. Their consumption is fine. It's the consumption of the vulgar masses. I think Earth First organized a puking in a shopping mall. How disgusting shopping malls are, ordinary people. There is a huge element of snobbery in green anti-capitalism. Capitalism, the problem with capitalism, they think, is that it has actually enriched the masses, not that it's impoverished them. That's the weird thing.
Martin, I can't stress enough to Planet Normal listeners what a serious and well-regarded filmmaker you are. Even with your often heretical views, your films have been broadcast on Channel 4. You've made extremely well-received films on subjects including the history of racial relations in America, a film on Britain's massive national debt. The one critique I've had of your film is that I felt you set up too false a dichotomy here. It's either we go completely net zero 2050 or we go to fossil fuels. I think there's a much more nuanced position here. I want to see us using less fossil fuels. I want to see us use more hydrogen. As somebody who is more than willing to have a conversation with you about the net zero industry and how it's deceiving people in many ways and lining its own pockets. I want to see us going to fuel sources like hydrogen. I want to see us achieving the battery storage technology that allows us to use renewables. Do you think there's something in that?
I think in terms of energy, I don't know about energy. I don't know about batteries. I don't know about hydrogen. I don't know about fossil fuels. I'd rather let the market decide. If it's cheaper to do one kind of energy generation, that's fine. If it's cheaper to do batteries and better to do batteries, that's fine as well. It's not that I hate electric cars. It's just that I think that the thing that should determine whether we have electric cars is the normal interplay of industry, the energy industry, manufacturing, and ordinary consumers. And whenever planners have become involved, they're usually motivated by things that aren't necessarily rational, but by other prejudices. The fact is that industrial society, which they sort of like to have a whack at, we have the cleanest society in the world. If you want the cleanest air, the cleanest rivers, generally you go to the most capitalist countries. The dirtiest countries are the socialist countries and the pre-industrial countries or the barely industrial countries. That's where the disgusting pollution is. That's where the short lifespans are. So I have a great faith in the market and just basic regulation about not doing, polluting rivers and that sort of thing. But otherwise, I'm happy to let the market decide energy policy. I mean, there shouldn't be energy policy, really. There should be an energy market.
Your film will have powerful forces arrayed against it, Martin. Do you foresee attacks on you? And finally, how do you think this spell, the very powerful spell, now be broken?
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be attacked. My Mrs. Kate begged me not to make the film because there'd be, goodness knows what repercussions. I made one in 2007, The Great Global Warming Swindle, and, it was like the roof fell on our head. And half the people who worked on the film are nervous about having their names attached, even though they've been very happy to work on the film. And, I've got a few changed names in the credits. And we were worried about whether we could get it into a cinema, whether a cinema would accept it. It was invitation only, the premiere, because we didn't want to advertise it widely because we thought we'd be shut down. The Spectator and the Telegraph are all very nervous about actually coming out fighting against this. Everyone's terribly timorous. But I think that's why it's so important to come out. We should really worry that the climate alarmists have such a monopoly of public discourse on this, that we have such an enormously powerful publicly funded establishment that is able to control directly or indirectly what we hear and what we read and what we're taught, what is okay to think and what's not okay to think. That in itself should worry us enormously. It was 17 years ago since I did The Great Global Warming Swindle, and there hasn't been a single big documentary criticizing the climate alarm since then. That's terrifying that there is such a stitch up on this issue. It is really worrying. I'm expecting to get kicked, but in a sense, the fact that I'm getting kicked made it all the more important to make the film, if you know what I mean. And in terms of what's going to be done, I think the only way this is going to be overturned is by people who are in the working class and the commercial middle class saying, we've had enough of low traffic neighborhoods, of being told, where we're going to put our rubbish and all that sort of thing. There's going to be there'll have to be a sort of revolution from below, because it's certainly not going to come from the effete middle class intelligentsia who are really promoting this.
Martin Durkin, thanks so much for joining us on Planet Normal.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for this latest edition of Planet Normal. Alison and I will be back with the very latest news and views from beyond the bubble on Thursday, the 22nd of August. In the meantime, stay in touch with us and with each other. Keep the emails rolling in to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk.
If you enjoy Planet Normal, please leave us a rating and a review on Spotify, because the co-pilot and I do love to read all the delightful reviews. It doesn't half cheer us up.
It does indeed. And on that bombshell, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.